With Photoshop CS6, support for video files has been considerably expanded. You can now add and mute audio tracks, create transitions and fades, use the text tool, and perform all the standard Photoshop edits on a video file. Before we jump into working with video, we need to learn how to set up a video file in Photoshop, and we'll talk about some basic video practices like US versus European standards, color for film and video, pixel aspect ratio, frame size and frame rate, file size and resolution, output recommendations, and some video preview on a broadcast monitor. To create a new file for video, just like creating a new file for anything else, go to your File menu, choose New, but in the preset, you're going to choose Film and Video. There are a bunch of other preset options under the Size menu. The main difference between these is the pixel size and the frame rate, which differ depending where in the world you happen to be. So for instance, the two most popular options are NTSC, which stands for National Television System Committee, and that runs at 29 frames per second, and PAL, which is a phase alternating line used mostly in Europe and runs at 25 frames per second. So NTSC is used in the United States, parts of South America, and Japan, while PAL is used throughout most of Europe, Africa, and Asia. There's really a third system too called CCAM, and that's used in Africa, Asia, and some parts of Europe. Let's take a look at the rest of the dialog box, and we'll just choose this first option. The width and height is determined by your size selection, and those are always working in pixels. You'll also always be working in 72 pixels per inch resolution. Now, just a word to the wise, sometimes, although probably not that often, depending on your particular working circumstances, sometimes a customer may ask you for a screenshot from a video project, and if you're working low res at 72 pixels per inch and they need it for a print project, it's going to look terrible if they try to print it, because for print you need 300 pixels per inch. So if you can anticipate needing something like that in the future, you can always bump up the resolution to 300, create your graphics, make a duplicate copy, and inside the duplicate reduce the resolution back down to 72. The 72 pixels per inch version would be used for video, and then you have that 300 pixels per inch version available to you for print. But that's sort of like a special scenario thing. You wouldn't necessarily need to do that every time, but it's something to keep in mind. So just remember that while you're creating these. If you need to do it, make sure you do it here. Color mode will always be RGB. RGB is for on-screen, so that's any video, film, web stuff, and 8-bit. The background contents is totally up to you. It can be white, a specified background color, or transparent. I usually leave it at white, and if I need to change it, I'll just change it through the Layers panel. In this advanced area down here, which may or may not be showing, the color profile is set to Don't Color Manage This Document, and that's the default for film and video, so you'd probably just leave it that way, although there are several other options you can choose from if you happen to know which one you might need to be working with. And as far as the pixel aspect ratio goes, this is determined by which size you choose up at the top, and we'll talk in a second a little bit more about pixel aspect ratio. Once you have everything set the way you like, click OK to open up your new document. You will see this dialog box open that shows you that pixel aspect ratio correction is for preview purposes only and that you could turn it off for maximum image quality. That's fine, just click OK. Again, we'll talk about pixel aspect ratio in just a second. So here's our open document, and we could bring in another file. So let's just quickly place a graphic. And we can move that into position like this. Now, as you can see, your rulers are on by default, but your guides aren't showing. And one of the nice features about working for film and video is that you will automatically get guides for your work. So I'm going to do Command or Control semicolon to show those guides that are already part of this blank document. And we'll talk a little bit about the action and title safe areas. These guides represent safe zones that are really helpful for editing files in Photoshop for broadcast and video. The reasons we use these guides is because of TV set overscan. Now, overscan is this process that cuts off part of the picture's outer edges to improve the middle image on the screen. And to make matters even more complicated, the size of the overscan actually varies from television to television. Therefore, to make sure everything fits, we'll make sure that you put your text in the title safe area, which is the inner boundary, and then put everything else within the action safe area, which is this middle space here. Now you can have your video actually extend beyond there, but anything of importance should be within this middle area and text should fall in the center. There's an action you can run to create a title safe overlay layer, and that can help you with remembering which part is which when you're new to working in film and video. So let's run that action. You'll have to open your action panel, and then in the options menu all the way at the bottom is a selection called Video Actions. You'll add that, and it will bring this folder of video actions into your actions panel. And then there's a bunch of different actions, and let's actually open this up so you can read them. You can create an alpha channel from visible layers, an inverted alpha channel. There's broadcast safe luminance, and we'll talk about luminance in just a second. Also saturation, or this broadcast safe option, which is a combination of the luminance and the saturation. And then there's slideshow options, and then this title safe overlay. So let's run the title safe overlay. To select it, make it run, click the play button. Give it a second to do its thing. Let's close that panel up. And now you can see that the title safe area is this inner space. The action safe area is that middle space. And anything that extends beyond that area towards the outer edges might get cut off due to overscan. So just keep that in mind while you're working. Since that's on its own layer, you can toggle it on and off as needed. Now let's talk about pixel aspect ratio, which is sometimes called PAR, P-A-R. This refers to the width and height of each pixel displayed on your monitor. Now, most digital imaging systems use square grids with a pixel aspect ratio, or PAR, of 1:1. However, in video, especially on some standard definition formats of digital TV, DVD, and video, the PAR uses non-square pixels. Now, Photoshop has a list of the most common formats that you'll be likely to use, and these can be found under the View Pixel Aspect Ratio menu, like so. So you could toggle between those if you need to. Now, also here is this option called Pixel Aspect Ratio Correction, and that goes on by default, so that while you're working in Photoshop on video and film files, you're going to see square pixels, even though you're actually working with non-square pixels. So as long as you let it stay on and continue working with it, your squares will look like squares rather than rectangles when you're drawing. Let's talk now about supported video file formats. In Photoshop Extended, you can open up the following file types and image sequence formats. There's MPEG-1 and MPEG-4, MOV files, AVI, FLV, that's your flash video. We got MPEG-2s, BMP, which is bitmap, DICOM, JPEG, OpenEXR, PNG or PNG files, PSD, which is your Photoshop files, Targa, TIFF, Cineon, and JPEG 2000. Now, in film and video, color gets a little more complicated. On a TV screen, colors really tend to shift somewhat, and we also need to be careful that our colors fall within a safe brightness range for television. All this technical stuff can be confusing when you're first starting to work with video, so for now, just remember to use RGB for all your video projects and ensure that your work falls within broadcast-safe levels of luminance and saturation. There are 3 ways that you can do this in Photoshop. The first way is to select your topmost layer in your Layers panel, and you'll add a Levels Adjustment layer. Now, in here, there's your input levels and your output levels. You would want to modify your output levels from 0 to 16 and from 255 down to 235. And this just makes the blacks a little less saturated and the whites a little less bright. So we're reducing the luminance, and this will improve the quality of your video when it's on a monitor. The second thing you could do is run a NTSC safe filter. You can access that filter through the filters menu. Let's see, we need to be on a different layer. And choose NTSC colors. The third thing you can do is go back to your actions panel and run the broadcast safe action. And that would be the last thing that you would do, probably on a duplicate copy of your original layered file, possibly a flattened file. Let's close this up now, and we'll talk about frame size and frame rate. Your frame size and your frame rate is another important consideration with video. When you're working in timeline mode, you can set the duration and the frame rate of a document containing video or animation. Let's open up our timeline panel, and it's minimized down at the bottom. Now, if you're going to be working with video, you would click this button to create a video timeline, and that will grab anything that it sees in the layers panel and duplicate those objects or layers over on the left side within the timeline. The duration, which is shown here at the bottom, the duration is the overall time length of a video clip in a document. And the playhead scrubber right here will allow you to span the full length of your video clip. The default duration is actually 5 seconds. There we go, there's 5. And you could usually see the time down here. The frame rate, which is also down at the bottom there, 29.97 frames per second here. The frame rate, or frames per second, that's what the FPS stands for. That's usually determined by the type of output you produce. So NTSC video has a frame rate of 29.97 frames per second, where PAL video has the frame rate of 25 FPS, and motion picture and film has a frame rate of 24. Now, depending on the broadcast system, DVD video can have the same frame rate as NTSC or PAL video, or a lower frame rate of 23.976. Video intended for CD-ROM or the web typically has a frame rate as low as 10 to 15 frames per second. If you need to change the frame rate, you'll choose the timeline frame rate from the timeline panel options menu right here. To set the timeline frame rate, you can choose any of these presets from the drop-down menu, or if what you need isn't in here, you can type in that changed number and then click OK. Just going to click Cancel. Now, if you need to change the duration of your video, you can grab any of these layers that are visible. Click here at the end and drag to the right, and this will extend the timeline. Notice that it says end in duration. That is how long the timeline should be. So if you knew you needed to go to 5:15, just drag it to here and release, and now you have effectively extended the timeline for this particular video clip. Now, when it comes to output, the file type often depends on your nonlinear editor, or NLE. Most NLEs require flattened artwork. For this reason, you should always save your original layered file as a Photoshop PSD file. Then make a duplicate of it. So let's say this is the file that is all finished. We're ready to render the video. You would go to the image menu and choose duplicate. And I would usually call this one the same name as my original, with the underscore flattened, so that I know which one is my original and which one is my flattened version. Then I can flatten all of my layers through this menu here, flatten image, like so. So now I have a flattened version, and then I would go to save through the file menu, file save or file save as, and choose my file format. The most common file types used for NLEs are PICT, Targa, and PING24. Now, as far as previewing your work in a monitor through FireWire, you'll need to use the 32-bit version of Photoshop to access the video preview plugin. You can find instructions about working with the video monitor on Adobe's help.adobe.com website by searching for the keywords previewing video and animation in their Photoshop help files area. The reason you would want to preview your work on a monitor before you turn it in is to check that the luminance values you have are accurate, so you're not dropping out any black or white areas, and that your font sizes are readable. With regard to fonts for video projects, print and web fonts tend to be in the readable size range of about 9 to 26 points. By contrast, though, video, people tend to look at their monitors from, 5 to up to 20 feet away from the screen. So this means that your fonts need to be much larger than you're probably used to working with. So while working, it's actually really important to be able to step away like 6 to 8 feet and look at your broadcast monitor to see if your fonts are readable. Also keep your audience in mind and size your fonts accordingly. So let's talk for a minute more about fonts. We're going to add some text to this file. Let me grab my type tool. And we'll make the font a little bit bigger so that you can see it. And we'll also make it a color that you can see. So this is Arial, and I'll make a copy of it, and we'll change the font face to something like Times New Roman. And we'll take a look at those side by side. These represent the two types of fonts that you'll be working with, serif and sans serif. Since video tends to flicker, the sans serif fonts, like Arial on top, are much easier to read on video and television monitors. So keep your display fonts large and make sure that you turn your anti-aliasing on. So let's grab the type tool again. Your anti-aliasing is up here. So if you had it turned off, your edges of your pixels would be a little bit jagged. So you'd want to make sure you have it set to one of these, sharp, crisp, strong, or smooth. Whenever possible, try to use the bold options, and sometimes it's called bold or black or something like that, because those tend to read easier on a video monitor. Also try to stay away from fonts that have any shapes on them that are smaller than about 3 pixels. And it would be spaces like this on the top of the E of the bottom hello version. I mean, that's pretty thin. And on a video monitor, since there is always a little bit of flicker, that area may actually look like it's not there. So watch for the size and the thinness of certain areas of your fonts. Super dark and super light colors are also really good, such as black, navy, and white. And you should, as a rule of thumb, though you don't certainly have to, it's a good idea to stay away from super saturated colors like yellows and reds. I always recommend watch some news for a little bit and see what other channels are doing for their lower thirds and the text that they display on the screen, and start looking for some stylistic cues. Look for all caps versus lowercase. Look for serif versus sans serif. Now, I didn't really go into detail about the difference between serif and sans serif. Sans serif fonts, sans meaning without in French, means that your letter shapes have just straight edges, whereas serif fonts means that your letter shapes have these little curlicues or other decorative elements along the edges or ends of the letter shapes. So look at the L. The L has a little flourish up at the bottom, kind of like a little pointy toe that points up, and it has a little bar across the top. So sans serif fonts do tend to render more cleanly than serif fonts, although I've seen both done well. So do spend a little bit of time watching television, observing the fonts that you see on screen. For a professional looking layout, try not to use more than 2 fonts per display. Some professionals also advise staying away from all caps, though I think that's a personal preference and something that you can use or not use depending on your particular situation. Also pay attention to the spacing between your letters. Now, some fonts have really nice kerning, which is the spacing between letters, and others might need to be modified a little bit. So for instance, let's make this all lowercase. Oh, actually, I think the font itself might have all caps turned on. Yes, it does. There we go. We'll make that a capital letter H. So the space between the E and the H is a little bit wide, and you can kern those together or move the space together by placing your cursor in between the 2 letters, holding down your Alt or Option key, and then using your left arrow to tighten up the space. You could increase the space by holding down your Alt or Option key and clicking your right arrow. So just use your eyes and your sense of balance to modify any letter spacing. And that fine-tuned type of detail will really help make your titles and your text display in your video and film projects look much more professional. Lastly, one thing you can do to make your fonts pop is to apply a drop shadow and or an outer glow. So if you have light text on a dark background, it might be nice to add the outer glow. So let's do this. We'll put a shape behind the bottom hello in black, and we'll drag that below the 2 texts. And we'll change the font color here to white so that we can see it. And now we can add an effect of a outer glow. And you can see that it's giving it just a nice sort of halo effect along the outside. Now, for this text on that background color and this color, you probably don't need it to be that bright. You could even go down to like 0, 1, or 2. It just needs to be a subtle effect, and we could toggle that on and off to help make your text a little more readable. You could also change the color, and depending on your layout, you may not need to do the outer glow, but sometimes an outer glow is a nice thing to do. Now for this other text, you might want to add a drop shadow. And the drop shadow also helps your text stand out. You don't have to keep the standard, which is multiply with black, 75% opacity, and a distance and size of 5. You could bring that down a little bit and soften it up a little, but it does help your text stand out from the background. Let's put some of the things we've just learned into practice by creating a brand new file. This time, I'd like you to choose the option called NTSC-D1 and click OK. There's your guides, and remember, the guides help you remember which parts are the title safe and the action safe areas. For that matter, let's rerun that action so that we can have that overlay layer in our Files panel. There we go. Now we're going to place a video file into our document. Use the File Place option, and let's select this guy. It's just a simple AVI clip. And notice that the placed file didn't come in exactly sized to our document. That's okay. Just hold down your Shift key, click and drag to make it fit, and hit Enter or Return on your keyboard to accept the transformation. And if needed, you might need to nudge your file a little bit up or a little bit down to fill the space. We're going to add a bar across the bottom, and we call that bar a lower third. Typically, it's a bar that runs all the way across. It has some kind of a background color, and then the text is laid on top of it. Think about those scrolling tickers that run on certain news programs, or sometimes you'll be watching a documentary and a bar will appear with the person's name and their title and where they are in the world or what they're talking about. That's what we're going to create here. Now, this particular file has a height of 480 pixels. So if we were to divide our document into 3 parts to create that lower third area, that would be 160 pixels. There is an info panel. Let's open that up here. This will show you the dimensions while you're dragging out a shape. So grab your rectangular marquee, and from the bottom, click and drag upwards. Now, it looks like we're working in inches here, so before we do that, let's change our ruler to pixels just by clicking on the ruler and choosing pixels instead. Now we can click and drag upwards and across, and we're looking for the 160 mark for the height. Now you may not be able to grab exactly 160 pixels. So one little trick that I use sometimes is I get as close as I can, and then I drag off the artboard with my up or down arrows, depending on where my selection is. In this case, I'll use my down arrow 1 tick. There we go. And now I have exactly a 160 pixel selection. So I can drag a guide from the ruler onto that selection, and now I have actually divided the screen into a bottom part is equal to 1/3. Now I would want to put my lower third within the title safe area, but that's also cutting off his chin here. So what I would probably do is nudge it down a little bit till it hits the action safe area and drag in a new guide and just make my lower third area within the title safe section only about 88 pixels. It doesn't have to be the full lower third height. It just has to be wide enough for you to include your text without cutting off too much of the video behind it. So to fill this in, I'm going to reset my colors and use my eyedropper to sample some of that purple behind his head. And then we're going to use our gradient tool to fill in that space on a new layer. The gradient bar at the top of the screen will give you a couple of options: your foreground to background color, foreground to transparent, and a bunch of other presets or other options that you may have already added to your library. We want the second option, foreground to transparent. You'll need to click and drag starting from the left, hold down your Shift key to constrain, and drag to the right a little bit off of the screen. Let's close this panel so we can see some more. Now I really want the left side to be fairly opaque and the right side to fade into transparency. So you may need to click and drag a few times to get that effect, but it doesn't matter how many times you drag. But I do want it to fade out on the right side. So now that's looking the way I'd like it to. I'm going to deselect my selection with the Command or Control D keyboard shortcut. Let's name this layer Bar. And in fact, if we were working with our title safe overlay, that would be at the top so that we can make sure that we see everything in place. I'm just going to hide it there. In fact, selecting the bar again, let's add a little bit of bevel and emboss to this and a drop shadow so that it sort of pops out a little bit more from the background. Click on the FX button and choose drop shadow. Now the drop shadow can be any size that you like. I'm just going to leave it the way it is here and also add a bevel and emboss. You can increase or decrease the size of the bevel. I want to keep it fairly low and click OK. Now, hiding my guides for a second here, you can see that the edge of the bevel emboss is actually showing on the left edge, and I would not want that to display. So one little trick that I do is I do Command or Control T so I can transform the shape and just drag that left edge off the side of the working space so that it's a clean bevel on top and bottom, but you don't necessarily need to see the left side. You could also do that for the right side just to ensure that there's no bevel appearing along the right edge as well. Now, I want to have two lines of type, and to visually separate them, I can actually delete a space. Let's do the single row marquee, and I'll just click somewhere around here and maybe nudge it up a little bit more, like so, and then I'm going to hit my delete key to remove that space, and you can do Command or Control D to deselect. Now, the space doesn't seem as separate as I would like it to be, so I might need to go back in and modify my bevel and emboss a little bit to separate those pieces. That looks pretty good, actually, with a size of 0. It looks a little more separate. Okay, now what I'd like to do is grab, oops, not with that tool, with this tool, I'd like to grab the bottom part of it, because I'd like that bottom part to be a different color than the top, which will also help separate the text that I want to include on top of it. Now, if you have semi-transparent pixels in your selection, you can lock them down so that they remain semi-transparent using the lock here, the first button on your layers panel. And then I can sample a color from the other side of him and use my gradient tool to fill that in. I'm just going to drag across holding down my shift key and might have to do it a couple of times to fill that space. So now the colors are definitely separate, though it looks like a single unified bar. Next we can add some type. So grab your type tool, and I'm going to reset the colors here again. Let's turn our guides on so we know where to place our type. Remember, you always want to use your title safe area for inserting your text. And we'll type in his name, which happens to be Tim Kolb. And then we can move it into position and modify the type properties. So I think for something like this, we might want to use a different font. Let's select it and choose Impact. Well, maybe we have to select it like this. There we go. And the size doesn't need to be that big. Let's bump it down to something like 40. We'll leave it at sharp, and then let's see. That's looking good, and we can add that outer glow just to give it a little bit of pizzazz. Probably bring the size down a little bit and click OK. Now when you have a type layer selected and you need to add another layer of type, grab your type tool and you would just shift click on screen and that will create a brand new type layer. So for this one, we can type in something like Adobe CS6 Production Premium. And we'll select all of it by double-clicking the thumbnail and bring the font size down. This does not need to be that big, so also let's use Arial. So you can use up to 2 fonts. Let's make the text white and drag it into position over here. It's snapping to my guides, which I love, and then all I have to do is nudge it up into position. Let's hide our guides again. I also like to always ensure that my type is left aligned with other type blocks. So I'm going to select both layers and use my left align option here to really make sure that they're absolutely left aligned. That CS6 production layer can be nudged up just ever so slightly, and I think I'll add a drop shadow to that guy just so it stands out. Make the size a little bit smaller and the distance a little bit closer just so that we can see it, like so. All right, so now we have our artwork ready to go. And all we would need to do is save this as a layered file. So File, Save. We can call it Tim Kolb, and we'll save it with the .psd file extension. Click Save in the desired location, click OK, and then you're done.